Hey guys, so me and Cassandra are going to be talking about environmental justice.
So unlike the other presentations in this class, we're not focusing on a specific research paper. We're more talking about this topic as well as how it relates to several things we've learned in this course.
Okay, so I'm going to be going over a brief overview of the presentation. So we will begin with talking about what environmental justice movement is, the relevance to this course, what are some concepts related to this, the econ perspective, ethics versus efficiency, real life examples, and we'll go over some questions for reflection and back. So I'm going to begin with explaining what is the environmental justice movement. So the environmental justice movement revolves around the idea that the gains and losses from the use and degradation of the environment are often unjustly distributed. In particular, racial minorities, other species, and future generations are often the most negatively affected group when examining the consequences of pollution, resource extraction, and environmental degradation. The main goal of the environmental justice movement is to ensure the fair treatment and consideration of all relevant interests, regardless of race, species, income, and whether they're in the present or future generations, and to have a more meaningful involvement with the current marginalized groups in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This movement started in the United States during the 1980s, and it was heavily influenced by the idea of environmental racism, which can be classified as a form of institutionalized racism that led to landfills, incinerators, and hazardous waste disposals being disproportionately placed in communities of color. This idea was later expanded on to encompass the idea of fair consideration to other species and future generations as well.
This movement was briefly discussed during our Chapter 7 lecture on the safety standard. For those who can't remember, demographics of those surrounding a toxic waste facility was mentioned, with disproportionate levels of people of color and low-income individuals living significantly closer to these hazardous waste facilities. From this, we see that the overall impact of this is rather uncertain due to the difficulties in seeing if the benefits of living close to these facilities versus the costs result in a net benefit. So when it comes to seeing these benefits, those that come to mind are probably cheaper housing. Furthermore, when it comes to pollution control, low income and minorities are paying a larger percentage of their income to this, but they also receive a greater benefit when control is implemented. With these factors in mind, it makes it increasingly difficult to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. Relating this movement to economics, we will mostly be focusing on efficiency as well as cost-benefit analysis to help us discuss the different standards. Firstly, willingness to pay and willingness to accept plays a big role in this. Additionally, we learned that in class the different standards considered are sustainability, safety, and efficiency. On one hand, the efficiency standard may argue that this environmental inequity should not be changed because of the net benefits, whereas something like the safety standard would disagree because the health risks of living near poses a lot of threats. Also, the sustainability standard would argue that the environmental justice is important for the safety and utility of future generations and species.
I will now discuss the economic perspectives of environmental justice, specifically the ethics versus efficiency debate. So, as I already mentioned, environmental justice also relates to other species and future generations. This encompasses the sustainability standard. The sustainability standard argues that current generations must leave certain amounts of capital stock for future generations, and other species are included in one of these capital stocks. Efficiency, however, might argue that we should deplete non-renewable levels of capital stock because it brings the most benefit to current generations. This shows that efficiency standard does a poor job at encompassing the interests of future generations and other species.
When considering why a disproportionate amount of lower income individuals live in such areas, the concept of willingness to pay and willingness to accept really come into play. Firstly, it is well known that if one is unable to pay for something, their willingness to pay does represent that, which is why we learned that those of higher income usually have higher willingness to pay. So in this case, one willingness to pay for building a house in a safer area is lower. For willingness to accept, they would also have a lower willingness to accept if potentially compensation was provided. So these two factors lead to the net benefits that we learned in our lecture. It is important to note that people may not have just moved into a place with an existing hazardous waste facility. In many cases, these facilities are built in areas with larger population of low-income individuals as well as minorities. Although many explanations behind this are quite political, when focusing on the economic side of things, once again, we have to bring in willingness to pay and willingness to accept. This ties into willingness to accept because if potentially the government provided some sort of financial compensation for building a hazardous facility, they would not have to pay those with lower income as much because they would be more quote unquote happy with a certain compensation compared to those of higher income individuals.
I will now be looking at some real-world examples of why environmental justice is so important. A study conducted in 2020 by UBC observed distinct patterns of inequality where marginalized groups in society consistently experience higher cumulative air pollution burdens. In particular, the study provided evidence that Indigenous residents in Vancouver, immigrant residents in Montreal, and low-income residents in Toronto are consistently experiencing higher cumulative air pollution than non-marginalized groups. This really shows the importance of having environmental justice to protect these individuals and marginalized groups from facing these unfair and unjust environmental burdens.
Thank you guys so much for listening to our presentation on the environmental justice movement. We hope that you enjoyed our thoughts behind this as well as how we believe it ties into this course. So now we have 2 questions to help with your reflecting. Do you believe that certain regulations should be put in place, such as tax money going to those who live near hazardous waste facilities as a financial compensation? How would this relate to willingness to pay or willingness to accept? Furthermore, what are some challenges that could result if this potential policy was put in place?
The second question would be, what would be the best way to balance the unique interests of current marginalized groups, future generations, in addition with other species as well?